Grandpa was putting away the candy after I returned from walking Glimmer back into the woods. If Grandpa thought anything about my time with his old flame, he didn't say anything. I hadn't exactly set out to begin a relationship with one of the creatures Grandpa was always warning me about in the woods, but it was something that had just sort of happened. The two of us tried not to rub it in his face, and I got the feeling that it made Glimmer a little bit uncomfortable if she thought about it too much. I wonder if I would be in Grandpa's shoes one day, watching my own kids or grandkids falling for this mysterious creature as well. I flopped into Grandma's old rocker, and Grandpa wasn't far behind me. He sat there with a contented smile on his face before looking over at me, a wide grin stretching across it. He tossed something at me, and as it flopped onto my chest, I could see it was a Reese's cup. I opened it gladly, realizing that Grandpa had likely saved it for me as the kids came to take handfuls of candy from the bowl. They were always very polite. Mountain kids seemed to have learned manners before they could walk, and Grandpa never minded sending them away with a few new cavities every Halloween. I managed to slide it into my pocket as the Helfrey boy was coming up. Figured you deserved two of your favorite things this year, he said with a little wink. I felt a little guilty as I nibbled at the chocolate disc, knowing the other treat he was talking about. Gramps, I feel a little weird about this. Is this okay? This isn't crossing a line, is it? What you mean, kiddo? Grandpa asked, his hand freezing as he reached for the remote. Glimmer and me, I don't want there to be any... But a knock turned both of us back to the front door. A muffled voice was laughing and saying, "Trick or treat," but Grandpa looked like someone had goosed him with a poker. He came shakily out of his chair, stepping carefully over to the door as he asked who it was. This made me feel a little strange. Grandpa never asked for a stranger's name before opening the door. Grandpa was always a good host, and welcomed anyone who came knocking into his house. "It's me, sir. Sorry, I know the light's off, but Clara and I wanted to hit your house before we went home." Grandpa smiled as he pushed the door open, revealing the McCaffrey twins from down the road. "Why, Kyle and Clara McCaffrey, I wondered what had become of you. Did you start at the bottom of the mountain this year?" Both kids, one dressed as Elsa and the other dressed as Thor, nodded. "We sure did. We wanted to end up closer to home, so we figured it would be easier to walk up with empty sacks, and we filled them." "Smart kids," Grandpa said. "Son, go get that bowl for these two wayward travelers in search of sweets." I pulled the bowl out of the cabinet, and Grandpa rationed the contents equally between the two. The two kids' face lit up, and they thanked him for their sweet treats. He told them to hurry home and not to get caught by anything spooky on the way up the mountain. They said they'd be careful, and off they ran as their hands came together. Grandpa watched them go, smiling as the two kids ran off for home. Good kids. They had me worried for a minute. I was worried they might be something else. He turned to find me grabbing a couple of beers out of the fridge as we stepped out onto the front porch, content to put my previous question on the back burner for now. Sounds like another Grandpa classic coming up. Grandpa laughed, having a sip as he held the beer out for a clink. "It was while I was in the army. Not all of us went to the front. Some of us had to go guard the Alaskan front from the Ruskies, and I was sent there for my first year and a half in the army. I would eventually make it to the front and come back alive somehow, but my time in Alaska was the strangest time of my life." He was just getting ready to get started when 4 feet came running back up the driveway. The McCaffrey twins came hustling back up the road in a hurry, and as they fell onto the porch, they were panting. They both started gibbering about how something had been lurking in the woods near the driveway, and how they were too scared to go home. They wanted to know if they could call their mom, and Grandpa told them that they could. They went inside, and Gramps told me to go grab a couple of root beers out of the fridge. When they came back, saying their mom was going to come pick them up in an hour and a half after she got off work, Grandpa offered them the bottles of cold root beer, and they took it gladly. We all clinked our bottles together, and the two drank deeply with sighs of happiness. "Well, is your story good enough for an audience, Gramps?" I asked. Grandpa looked at the two kids as though weighing their worthiness. "I dunno. You two think you're brave enough for a real spooky story?" Both nodded excitedly, clearly having grown up on Grandpa's stories. "Well, okay then. It was my first year away from home, my first time outside of Georgia, and I found myself in a frozen land during Halloween. I was stationed in Alaska with my platoon, watching the shores for Stalin and his sneaky beachlanders, which would surely want to take back the oil they had once held there. It never happened, of course, but we stayed there for a year and a half as we froze our backsides off. Our days were generally spent bundled up to the eye teeth, sitting in watch stations when we weren't sitting around the barracks. I picked up some skills, learned to play the guitar, and generally used my time to better myself while my checks went home to my parents. I was sitting in my bunk one night, trying to get some sleep as some of the others played cards, when there was a knock on the door to the barracks. "Trick or treat," came a voice from the door. Private Marsh looked up from his hand and side-eyed the door. "Trick or treat?" Private Dre snorted. "Probably just those Company D boys playing around." "I dunno. I guess it could be kids from town," Corporal Snyder said. He was our platoon leader, but he was just as bad as the rest of us. "How the hell would kids from town get to our barracks?" Marsh asked, laying down 2 cards and taking 2 from the deck. "Well, this place is pretty run down," Snyder hedged. "Depending on who's on guard duty, it wouldn't be hard for a couple of kids to wander in without anyone being the wiser." There was another knock on the door and another chorus of "Trick or treat," which drew the eyes of everyone at the table. "Well, someone go check and see who it is," one of the sleepy privates on the other side of the barracks said. "I've got watch later, and I'd like to get a little sleep." No one seemed to want to get up and check, despite having plenty of excuses to explain the knocking. They were just kids. They'd leave if no one answered. It was just those jerks from Company D. Better to ignore it. But after 10 minutes of knocking, I finally rolled over and walked to the door. I probably made quite a sight in my BDU pants and my sock feet, and I shivered as the cold hit my bare chest. Everyone at the table looked at me, looking silently pleased that it wouldn't have to be them to go do it, and as they watched, I walked towards the barracks door. I pushed it open and was greeted by blowing snow and an empty front stoop. The light over the door made the snow sparkle a little, but there were no kids standing around waiting for treats. Unless they wanted shoe polish or sea rations, they would have been out of luck anyway. The guys from Company B, my platoon, were usually too broke to buy drinks at the canteen since most of us were sending our money home to our families. Most of us were sons from poor families, newlyweds with babies at home, or kids paying off debts through the service. We didn't just hand out candy to passers-by, though we would have figured something out if it were a bunch of tacks. I glanced around, decided it was moot, and closed the door with a shrug. "Looks like we took too long." As if in response, someone knocked again. "Trick or treat." I opened it again, figuring they must have just seen the light and decided to run back, but there was nothing there. That's when I realized that there weren't any footprints and the 2 feet of powder sitting around the stoop either. If there were kids walking around, there should be footprints. But there was nothing coming to the barracks or walking away from it. I closed the door, but this all began to feel a little odd. I might be 1,000 miles from home, but this was beginning to feel like being back in the woods again. "Guys, there's no footprints out there," I told them, but I don't think they understood. "Well, the snow is still coming down," Jameson, one of the other guys at the table, said. "I guess their tracks would have been covered up pretty quick." "Yeah, but not that quickly. If they knocked and ran away, there should still be prints out there." Snyder nodded, looking like he meant to add something, but he closed his mouth when someone knocked on the back wall, the cheap corrugation sounding tinny. There was another knock on the west wall a second later, then one hard enough to send snow falling off the roof, and then from the east wall, and the door again. Each knock was punctuated by a cheerful "trick-or-treat," but I realized that the voice always sounded the same. Not similar, but precisely the same. Each knock was followed by the same "trick-or-treat," and the repetition was a little frightening. Some of the other guys had started to realize this too, and I could tell that it was spooking them as well. Marsh stood up then, shouting that this was getting out of hand. He was going out there, still certain that it was the Company D guys playing a joke, and as he pulled on his boots, he looked at the card table to see if anyone was coming with him. Dre slid on his own boots, his coat already on, and Jameson started pulling on his layers. Snyder was telling them to just let it go, but they were having no part of it. "Don't go out there," said a deadpan voice from beside the door, and all of them looked up to see that White had climbed out of his bunk. White was from the region, a native actually, and he had a look I imagine others had seen on my face from time to time. "It's not Company B, and it sure as shit ain't no kids. It's something different, something older, and if you go out there, you won't be coming back." Marsh stopped for a moment, looking at the men around him and scoffing loudly. He told White that he wasn't going to be tricked by some damn kids. The three of them walked out to the stoop, looking out into the winter wonderland, Marsh's cigarette looking strange in the cold weather as it puffed out against it. They started into the darkness outside the halo of light, looking for any signs of whoever had been knocking. I stayed in the barracks, my bare chest prickling as the cold outdoor air hit it, and I was thinking about going to get my own jacket. Maybe this was just a Halloween prank, and if we went out after them, we could find out who was behind it. White took a hold of my arm, though, as if reading my thoughts, and when he shook his head in the face of my confused stare, I stayed put. When Marsh heard something trill out, "Trick-or-treat," from the nearby mess hall, he and the others were off. They tromped through the snow, crunching along as they headed for the sound. They hadn't taken rifles, not figuring they would need them, and as they disappeared, Snyder threw his hands up and said he was going to bed. "If those idiots want to freeze to death, then let 'em. Bunch of buffoons will have to work with the colds they get out there tomorrow." He scooped up the pot in the middle of the table and went to bed. White still had his hand on my arm, but he let go pretty quick when he realized that he was still holding it. I sat on the edge of his bunk, looking at him questioningly, wanting to know what he knew, but not daring to ask. He kept looking towards the door, the sound of the men traipsing through the snow getting farther and farther away. "They shouldn't have gone out there. The Kushtaka will be waiting for them out there." "The what?" I asked, leaning in curiously. He told me about the Kushtaka, a nasty little creature that was half otter and half man. They were said to help fishermen sometimes, but more often than not, they lured them to their deaths. They could mimic the screams of a woman or a child to accomplish this, but he supposed that maybe it had learned a new trick. He told me they were devious, so it wasn't too far-fetched to assume that they might have acquired a little something new over the last century or two. "So, if I had gone outside," I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it, "you'd be dead," he said, matter-of-factly. We sat up a little bit that night, talking about legends from the area, and he was interested in hearing about the boogans that skulked the hollers as I was in hearing about what went bump around the tundra. His people had a very interesting collection of creatures, and when it was my turn to go watch, he offered to come with me and continue our conversation. We shared a lot of stories, he and I, and White became one of my best friends. Of the 3 that went out that night, only Jameson ever came back. They found him frostbitten in the woods behind the base, and he was discharged after losing a foot and his left arm to the cold. He kept gibbering about shadowy, slippery things and how his friends had been dragged off towards the water. I never saw him again, but I saw other things out there on the icy banks of Anchorage. We all sat quietly, listening to the story, and the perspiration that ran down my bottle was very cold against my palm. When the lights of an approaching station wagon lit the porch, everyone but Grandpa jumped a little. "Mommy!" both kids squealed, thanking Grandpa for the root beer and the candy before running to the car. Grandpa smiled as he watched them go, but I still had questions as his story came to an end. "So, was it the Kushtaka?" I asked. Grandpa shrugged. "Whether it was or not, they still never found those 2 privates from my platoon. They dredged the waterfront, they searched the woods, but they never found a trace of Private Marsh or Private Dre. And from what I heard, Private Jameson was never in his right mind ever again." Grandpa watched the taillights disappear down the driveway, looking to the woods as if searching for the thing that had scared the kids. "Remember that, kiddo. Only some people who go into the woods come out again. Some never come out, and some come back broken. But some go in again and again, and never feel more than a momentary sting." "Are you trying to warn me about—" But he cut me off with the sound of his bottle as it sailed off to shatter against a nearby tree. The motion was smooth, practiced, and filled with zero malice. Grandpa threw the bottle into the woods because he always had, and when he turned back to smile at me, I knew he wasn't mad. "I'm telling you that it's okay if you want to see her. It's okay if you want to do more than see her, but don't forget what she is. Glimmer can't help what she is, no more than you can be held responsible for your humanity. But don't forget that there are things in her world that hate you because God gave you a soul and a choice. I can't prove that none of them have a soul, but I know they hold such things against us. I won't tell you not to see her, but I will tell you to be careful, boy. Be careful, and be prepared." He left me to think about it, and I heard the TV come to life as he took his recliner again. It seemed life was only going to get tougher from here. "Well, damn," I said, slamming the book closed as I laid it on the arm of the chair a little harder than I meant to. "What's wrong?" Grandpa asked, looking up from his Louis Lamar novel. I looked over and could see the snow beginning to fall behind him again. I had hoped the snow would hold off for a little while longer, but it looked like we could be snowbound again. The lull in the snowfall today had been the first time we'd been able to get out on the old truck for about a week, and we had taken the opportunity to get some groceries, eat a meal that we didn't have to cook, and make a trip to the used bookstore in town. Grandpa had a ton of books, but he was always in the mood to get a few more. To his credit, he always bought them, read them, and then shelved them before getting another one, a system I never quite took to. I'd found 3 of the 4 Dragonlance novels, and had been chewing my way through them while we were snowed in. I had hoped to find the 4th one, Dragons of Summer Flame, and, as if sent a gift from Providence, it was sitting midway down the 3 for $1 bin. I should have checked it out before I dropped a whole 33 cents on it, but I'd been too excited to finish the story, and now I'd have to pay the price. "Someone tore the last few pages out of my book," I said, my anger growing the longer I thought about it. "Now how will I know how it ends?" Grandpa laughed. "Could be worse. I suppose the pages could be blank. Then you'd know the ruin ate them." I scrunched up my brows. "The what?" "A ruin," Grandpa said, marking his place in his book. "It's the bane of all written words, and those who enjoy them." "Yeah, I heard you, but what is it?" "They look like little foxes, and they live in the margins of the books. They eat words, and they steal secrets. something they hoard like a dragon's treasure. I stared at Grandpa for a few minutes to see if he was messing with me, but the longer he stared back, the more I realized that he was serious. Why shouldn't he be? We had faced a creature made from a mass grave just this fall, and Grandpa had spent his time before that teaching me about the different creatures that called the Appalachian wilderness their home. Of all the things I'd heard about in that time, you'd think that nothing would surprise me anymore, but this definitely caught me off guard. Grandma used to say that they were the bane of a well-stocked library. I saw a pair of them once while I was stationed in Alaska. Cute little devils, but they almost ran my friend's sister out of business. Was this the native guy you befriended? I asked, tossing the book on the nightstand, as it was far more interesting to hear this story. Indeed. John White was one of my best friends. It was fortunate that he didn't go to the front lines when the time came, though I doubt he thought himself fortunate at the time. One story at a time, Gramps. Let's talk about these fox things first. Grandpa smiled, tilting his head as he tried to think of a good starting point. I guess it all started when his sister came to visit us at the barracks. Elise was a few years older than John, and they could have been twins if not for the glasses. She came trudging up to the barracks one morning just as we were finishing the top-to-bottom barracks clean that we did every Wednesday, and John separated from us so he could go speak to her. The men were curious. Most of them hadn't seen a woman in about 3 months, what with the snow. Elise didn't have anything for them, though. She talked with John, and they spoke a while in the language the natives spoke on the res. When John pointed at me, his sister looked dubious. They spoke a little longer, and without warning, they parted like players in a huddle. As John came back, he picked up his shovel, and the two of us started pushing sludge off the walk. "Everything okay?" I asked, after he'd shoveled in peace for a few minutes. "Allah is having trouble with a spirit. At least she thinks it's a spirit. It's not like anything she's ever experienced before. I know you have experience with these things. Do you think you might be able to come and help us?" I told him I'd be glad to, and we started making plans for the next time we had leave from the base. As it happens, we both had weekend passes coming up, so we decided that next Friday we'd go into Willowbrook, the city his sister lived in, and see if we couldn't help her. It wasn't uncommon in those days to get leave pretty regular. The war was starting to rattle down a little, and Alaska wasn't exactly under attack every day. Saturday morning, we bundled into the old Jeep in the motor pool, flashed our passes, and headed into Willowbrook. Now, before joining the Army, I only thought I was from a podunk town. Willowbrook was a pothole in the road by comparison. It was a reservation town, about 3,000 or 4,000 people in all, with a little main street, a gas station, and a lot of tribal housing scattered willy-nilly about. The Army guys went in to drink at the Whale's Belly, the local tavern, or to pick up some comforts at the general store, but that was about the length of where we were tolerated. The reservation guys didn't like us, and most of the Army guys didn't like them either, but we kept a certain amount of ignorance of each other and went about our lives. So when an Army Jeep rolled through town during the daylight hours, you can imagine that it made a little bit of a stir. People watched us drive by with sullen faces full of mistrust, and the sight of a equally native John behind the wheel did very little to change those looks. John took it all in strides, but I could tell it hurt him a little. To have your own people look at you like an outsider was a little different than being an outsider yourself. And when he lifted a hand to an older woman and her daughter, a greeting that was ignored, he let it drop slowly. "They don't like that I joined the Army," he told me, as if I hadn't worked that out already. "There's been a lot of tense separation of the reservation people and the military, a separation that I have violated." "I'm sure you had your reasons," I told him, but he only snorted. "My reasons were that Dad wandered off into the woods one night, drunk off whiskey, and never came back. My reasons were the 4 siblings left at home that needed to be fed, and a mother who slid into the same bottle that killed my father. Allah helps. That's why she understands why I enlisted, but the community just sees it as a betrayal. We pulled up outside a squat little building with a sign that declared it to be a public library, and I was surprised to see a little shit-splat town like this with such a service. My own hometown didn't even have a library, wouldn't until almost 1955, and as we walked inside, it seemed to be little more than a long hallway. The shelves were pushed against the walls, giving it a slightly claustrophobic feel, and I couldn't imagine looking for a book in here if it was busy. There was a desk at the end of the hallway, and as we came in, John's sister looked up and greeted us. "You must be the mountain man John's talked about. I'm Elise. Welcome to my library." I shook her hand, thanking her for inviting me. "It's a little cramped, but I'm impressed how well stocked it is." She looked around at the little shelves almost lovingly, clearly pleased with what she had done here. It took a lot of convincing to get the elders to agree to the space, even more to convince the governor to let me utilize the library resources to get the books I'd need for educational pursuits. They don't seem to understand why a bunch of natives might want to learn more than hunting seals and eating snow. Go figure. She flashed a sardonic grin, and I couldn't help but laugh. After spending time around the serious-minded John, I had expected his sister to be of similar temperament. Elise, however, was downright vivacious. She was a little older than John, about 4 years his senior, and it appeared that she was just as serious about her aspirations as John was. She was a knowledge seeker, someone interested in understanding more than what resides in this world, and she reminded me a little of my grandmother. She made us some tea from a little kettle on the wood-burning stove and told us about her problems. It all started about a week ago. I was shopping in the next town for paperbacks and came across a guy selling a crate of rare books. I looked through them, and sure enough, there were some first editions in there. Most of them were ratty, definitely second-hand, but beggars can't be choosers. For someone with a budget as small as mine, a crate of books for a price so low was too good to pass up. But once I got them back to the library, I realized I'd been had. The books had been vandalized. Pages were blank, paragraphs were missing, some of the books were just completely empty. I got the books that were complete and put them on the shelves, but that's when the others started disappearing. Books I'd had for months, books I'd had since I was a little girl, started being returned incomplete. Paragraphs from the middle of the book, sentences with certain words, and finally, whole books had been scrubbed clean. I don't know what was doing it, but I know it wasn't natural. "How can you tell?" John asked. She took a book off a desk and showed us a series of small paw prints inside it. "They've left these prints in quite a few books. The weird part is, the prints are made with ink, but they're always dry, and they don't smudge on any of the other pages. If it were only a book or two, I could let it slide. Everything must eat after all, but it has eaten 30 books in the last 6 days. Many others are now incomplete, missing parts of their story, and I don't have the budget to replace so many books. I need them to stop. I need this to stop, because if it doesn't, then the council will close the library for sure." John was perplexed, but I knew exactly what she was dealing with. "They're fox prints," I said, and both of them looked at me in surprise. "As far as I can tell, yes," Elise said, "but how did you know that?" "They're called ruins, or ruins. I'm not sure. Grandma's accent made it a little hard to tell, but she had an infestation of them in her library once. She had picked them up in an old book she'd bought from a traveling man, some collection of old herbs and poultices, and it chewed through some of her books before she caught it. Little terrors, she called them, but she knew just how to trap 'em. "How do we do that?" John asked, intrigued by the idea of something he'd never seen before. "They like to eat written word, but there's one thing above all else they can't resist, and that's secrets. I remember how my grandma had taken out an old leather book from a shelf, lovingly running her fingers over the cover before opening it to a spot in the middle. She inscribed a mark over the childish writing inside, dragging her finger over the page after dipping it in an inkwell, and mumbling to herself. I was small, so I didn't have any clue what she was doing. The symbols she drew lit up a little, and when she closed the book, she laid it on the desk and said it wouldn't be a problem anymore. I asked if Elise had an old journal, something from when she was a kid, and she said she had just the thing. She told us to watch the library for her, and about an hour later she came back with a little notebook under one arm. It's from high school. I'd kept it for an English class, and after the assignment I just kept writing in it. I've been writing in it for the last 4 years. I don't know if there's any particularly good secrets in it, but hopefully it'll help. I paged through looking for something good, and finally came to something I thought would work. It was a passage about a boyfriend that she'd kept from her parents, a boy named Erutious. Her parents wouldn't have approved of him, their fathers not really getting along, and she had dated him for nearly a year before they had broken up, her parents never having learned about the relationship. It was a secret that had never been learned, and it would be very tantalizing to her ruin. I smudged the page with an ink pen that she had on her desk, making the appropriate sign as I finished the sigil that would seal them inside the book. Leave it out somewhere. They won't be able to resist the pull of secrets. It's in their nature. The ruin will be trapped in the book, forced to eat the words until it starves to death. She thanked us, and we returned to the base, John thanking me for helping his big sister. She's always loved books, and operating a library was a dream come true for her. I'm glad that she can make a living doing something that she loves. His sister came to visit us a few days later, but she'd had a change of heart, it seemed. When she came charging through the gates about midday, I think I'd have rather stood in the way of a charging polar bear. We were at the canteen, moving some supplies off a convoy that brought us our stuff, and John and I were sitting with a few of the other boys as we soaked up the few hours of sun we'd be allotted that day. We saw her when she came up the road, having walked the 3 miles from town, we had no doubt, and John looked worried the closer she got. He told me later that she was wearing the look she wore when you had done something wrong, the look that said that she was about to beat the tar out of you, and it made him feel about 5 years old again. "Get them out," she said, pushing the book at me, and it was the same journal I had used to trap the ruin in, and I was confused as I looked from the book to her. She had her hands on her hips, her face a mask of rage and concern, and the red around her eyes told me that she had been crying. I opened the book and found a pair of sad little foxes on the inside, their images cast across many of the pages and in the margins. It appeared that she had a pair of rune, perhaps a mated pair, and as I flipped through the pages, the 2 of them seemed to have added to their little family. One of the drawings implied that the other was heavily pregnant, and as I flipped further, I saw her cuddled up with a small group of creatures. Many of the words were gone from the page, the rune having picked them clean for the little family they were cultivating, and the little blue fox that looked out from the page seemed very worried. "You know they'll eat your library bare," I asked her, seeing the rune family was now 8 strong. One rune destroyed years of herbology notes that my grandmother was keeping. I can't imagine what 8 would do. "I don't care," she said. "I don't want to watch them starve to death. They have babies. I can't just sit by and watch them die in the trap we've set." Truth be told, Grandma hadn't been capable of watching it either. She would drive away demons and banish haints, but I'd seen her catch spiders in glasses and take crickets to release outside. She'd taken the book she used to trap the rune in out to the woods and burned it, saying that it would set him free. If he comes back again, then there's no help for him, but as long as he stays away from my library, I don't see why he can't live in peace. The sudden memory of watching the flames burn the old book away, the ashes rising into the sky as they seemed to turn into a red fox of ash, gave me an idea, and I told Elise what she must do. Take it far away from the library and burn the book. It won't hurt them, and once the sigil is destroyed, they'll be free to leave the book and go about their business. That business might take them back to your library, but if they sense that your intentions are good, they might also move on without a fuss. That seemed to soften her some, and she took the book and thanked me for the help. The Rune family never came back to the library, and I don't know what became of them, but I do know that there was a fire at a nearby military archive that year, about 100 miles from our base. I can't prove anything, but I suppose it's possible that someone found military files and classified documents with holes in the information and decided that it would be easier to burn the whole thing to the ground than explain to the higher-ups. Either way, I'd have hated to have been the man who had to control the tombs when he began to find the words missing on files that could have him locked in military prison for a long damn time. Grandpa leaned back as he finished, looking a little wistful as he thought about his time in Alaska. If I'd had any sense, I'd have stayed in Alaska. It was a hell of a place, a land of wonder and possibility. I nodded, thinking about his story. Good to know that the Appalachians aren't the only place with strange creatures. Grandpa laughed, though it does have some of the most interesting ones. I saw a few in Europe too, though, when my unit was drug over there for a while. Maybe I'll tell you about it sometime, he said, getting out of his chair and hobbling down the hall. Making an early night of it, Gramps? I asked. But whether he meant to sleep or lay with his memories for a while, he never said. Reminds me a little of the last time I followed tracks in the snow. The steam rose as I blew into my hands, looking back at Grandpa as we made our way through the snowy forest. It was February, and the weather had been temperamental since Thanksgiving. We had experienced some thick snow since the 1st of December, and the usual decorations had looked pretty festive this year as they huddled amidst it. We had picked up as many of them as possible, but I knew that come spring we would find more of them buried where the snow had been. It figured this would be when Clarence, the cat owned by Grandpa's closest neighbor, would have chosen to get loose. Clarence was a large Mancoon, fluffier than most dogs, and she had been on the phone to Grandpa when I looked up to see the temperamental feline loping through the snow in front of our house. Grandpa had gone out to try to sweet-talk the ball of fur, looking ridiculous in his pajama pants and rain boots, as I stood on the porch and tried to get him to bundle up. He had been sick throughout Christmas, a nasty flu having put him to bed, and I'd been afraid I might wake up one morning to find that he had wheezed out his last. Then, the day before New Year's, I'd gotten up to find him cooking breakfast and feeling more like his old self. Now he was out in the snow looking for a cat, though he was more likely looking for a good case of pneumonia. To his credit, he had put on his cold weather clothes before heading out into the woods. He looked like a small bear in his snow pants and thick furry coat, his fluffy hat with the ear covers pulling the whole illusion together. Among other things on the long list of Grandpa's talents, he was a great tracker and had taken to the woods to find the cat. It didn't exactly take a master hunter to follow the cat's trail today, and it looked more like he had bounded from snowbank to snowbank. "Oh?" I said, feeling that maybe a Grandpa story would help move things along. "Of course, we were following something a little bigger than a cat that time." I shivered as Grandpa pushed a branch out of the way, a snowbank falling on top of my head. The cold powder fell off, thankfully, before it could melt and soak through my thick coat. "Hunting wolves?" I asked, joking but a little curious to know what Grandpa could have been hunting in the army. "Bigger than that," he said, looking between a pair of prints and following the smaller of the two. "Bear, maybe?" "Nope," he said, looking back to grin wickedly. "It was nothing short of the most dangerous prey of all. Man." John and I were on guard, keeping each other company through the cold night, when I first saw the lights off over a snowy hill. I could see a truck trudging angrily over the hills of snow, its lights heading for the nearby forest. The local woods weren't a great one, little more than 50 or 60 acres of dense and hardy mountain trees. The trees in Georgia were no lightweights, but these Alaskan trees were definitely built for the weather. You might ask what anyone was doing out in the middle of the night that close to the woods, but it was February, a little before Valentine's Day, and it had been dark nearly all day. In reality, they were driving up there about 6 p.m., right about the time our watch had started. And soon I could see a fire winking on the horizon. "Surely they aren't camping out there," I said to John. "Why not?" he asked. "If they've spotted a caribou herd and can take a few of them, all the better for the tribe." He took out his binoculars to see if he could catch a glimpse of anyone in particular, but despite the clearness of the night, it was no good. The best John could determine, there were 5 figures around a fire, and they seemed to be getting ready to head into the woods. He was a little more interested than I thought was strictly healthy, and finally John scoffed as he put down the binoculars and shook his head. "They can't be going into the woods. No one with any sense would go into the woods after dark." I snorted and commented that it was always dark this time of year, but John didn't laugh. "There are things here that know the difference between dark and night. If they're out there this late, they're either very foolish or they have grit." "Let's hope it's the grit, then," I said, my breath puffing out as we kept our eternal vigil over the frozen tundra that stretched brightly around us. By this time I had been in Alaska a year, the first of my 3-year stretch over there, and the cold never got any easier to handle. I don't remember being warm the whole time I was in Alaska. Not the sort of warm that I was used to. I was accustomed to sitting by a river bank as spring bloomed, catching the sluggish fish that lays through the snow melt. Alaska was beautiful, without a doubt, but I never quite acclimated to the weather. A few days later, John woke me up around midday, his own eyes a little less bleary this time. "I need your help, if you're willing." It was all he had to say. I was up and dressed in a matter of minutes, accepting a mug of cowboy coffee from John. He was dressed warmly, his thick service coat pulled up to the ears, which were covered by a furry hat I'd seen him wear often on post. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his boots had fresh snow clinging to them. "What do you need?" I asked, pulling on my own coat and grabbing my sugging cap. Apparently one of those foolish kids around the fire was my godson, Liam. He and some of his friends were looking for something that had taken some livestock off the farm, and they've been gone for 2 days. Charlotte is beside herself, and no one from the village wants to go into the woods to look for him or his friends. She called me earlier to ask if I'd help her, and I know how good you are in a pinch. I was already on board, but I was a little curious as we set off for the major's office. "Why won't anyone come help you find your godson?" John and I had been friends long enough that his silence told me more than his words. I could hear him grinding his teeth, a clear sign that he was overthinking something, and as the long house that served as the major's office got closer, he still hadn't made a decision. What was so important that he couldn't tell me, I wondered. There might be something dangerous out there, something that might require more than a rifle round. He looked at me like I might refuse to go now, but I laughed as I kept heading for the office. It wouldn't be the first boogin I've met on its own turf. Let's go, John. We're wasting lack of daylight. An hour later, and we were both heading towards the woods, the old Jeep tires slipping a little on the fresh snow. The Major hadn't wanted to let us both go. He didn't see any reason to let two soldiers slog through the woods looking for some town kids, and John's face had gotten pretty red when he'd said it. He looked like he meant to go no matter what the Major said, but I stepped in and reminded him that we were only loosely tolerated in the settlement. They took our money and they let us live in their shadow, but they saw us as outsiders, and that was never gonna change if we didn't show them that we could belong. Say the two of us go off in the woods and never come back. You can just say the two of us were deserters and that you told us not to leave. But if we find these kids, we're a couple of soldiers doing right by the town. Either way, you stand to lose very little and gain quite a lot. Major Charlotte was a Idaho native, about as big as his desk. I would have put him against any Rooski who wandered in, and maybe even some of the grizzly bears out there. He wasn't the brightest bulb on the base, but he could see a positive spin when it was shoved in his face. You boys got till tomorrow, quadruple zero. If ya ain't back to base 'fore then, I report yas deserters. If ye ain't back 'fore then, I suggest you find a comfy spot to hunker with the Injuns. He allowed us to take our rifles and even told us we could borrow a Jeep to get out there. "Done drive my Jeep through the woods. On guard, boys," he warned us, and we promised that we wouldn't drive the Jeep off-road. We pulled up next to another Jeep that we had seen a few nights before when we were on post. It was 1400, but it was as dark as early evening. We flipped our torches on, and after some tromping, we found the remains of their campfire. They had left behind a few bottles, a little liquid courage, it seemed, and some wrappers from sandwiches or food of some kind. John was looking around the campsite, trying to find something to tell him what direction they had gone, but I knew it would be futile. It had snowed for 2 days, and the powder was nearly deep enough to cover the campfire. I waged that we'd find them somewhere in the woods if they were still alive. Is there a house out there? A cave, maybe? Somewhere they could have gotten out of the cold? John looked back at the foreboding canopy and shuddered. I have no idea. We don't go into these woods, or never did when I was young. Why? I asked, thinking it odd that anyone could quash the urge to take to the woods in search of game or just adventure. John looked at the midnight gathering of frosty trees and sighed stoically. It appears we have some time. Would you like to hear a story of these woods? I told him I would, and we crunched along as we headed into the tree line. My grandmother told me that long, long ago, when we were outsiders here, we came to settle and were hunted by something that we could not run from, something we could not escape. It came at night, hunting us as we shivered in our tents. Those who stood against it died. Those who hid were found, and no one was sure what to do. It wasn't just our tribe either. When we came together, other tribes reported losing people to this thing. Some believed it was death itself, come for us since we had dared to enter its domain. But others believed it might be something different. Our elders had faced things like this before, these creatures of the other world, and came out the victors, and they believed that they could do it again. As John told his tale, I began to see the woods around us as something different. I felt comfortable as the trees shaded us from the expressive sky, the womb of the woods, a place I had always loved in my boyhood. It was just another forest, my mind told me, and I knew how to move in a forest. I said I had never felt the warmth I had known in Appalachia, but as I moved naively through these woods, I felt a strange sort of warmth spread through me, the warmth of homecoming. And so, all the elders came together to discuss the issue. For days they deliberated, people still being drug off in the night. They discussed how it could be done, but they knew that they would have to know what they were dealing with first. They would need to trap the beast, and where better than a place it would feel safe enough to get cocky. They drew it into the woods with something they knew it couldn't resist, and when the trap was set and the sacrifice was released, they began to close the snare. As I moved through the woods, however, and John began to lay out his story, the forest changed. No longer was it a comfortable jaunt through the woods, but a crouching beast waiting to spring. Was this how the people in John's story had felt? Walking meat, just waiting for the butcher to come for them. The deeper we went, the more the beauty seemed like rouge smeared across the face of a monster. The farther in we went, the more that quiet weight hung around me. The barely contained hush seemed to be holding its breath, so I would drop my guard. As we clumped through the woods, my mind presented me with a picture of the beast that would be stalking us. A huge wolf, some massive black hound as big as a bear, stalking the woods as it followed us. It would be waiting behind a tree, peeking from behind a snowbank, and when it caught sight of me, it would grin with a mouthful of nasty teeth that would part to reveal its deep throat full of bellowing growls. It would blot out the moon as it leapt at us, burying us beneath its bulk and killing us before we could even scream. I was looking around, trying to catch the beast before it got us, when I tripped over something in the snow. As I looked to see what had spilled me, I found the first of our lost boys. His eyes were big and staring, frost forming on the orbs as he looked off into the woods. My foot had crunched through what I thought was ice, but turned out to be a gout of red that had turned solid. Something had ripped his throat out, leaving his meat frozen in the cold. His face was locked into the most exquisite look of terror, and I was tempted to run back to the jeep before I could encounter what had scared him so much. "Look," John whispered, pointing away from the body and towards the drag marks through the snow. It made a perfect little trail of frozen blood for us to follow, complete with several large and foreboding footprints. "Come on," John said. "That seems like a pretty good clue to me." As we walked on through the frozen wonderland, I suddenly couldn't stand the stifling quiet. "So, what was it?" "Could be a bear, maybe a wolf. Can't think of anything else that would—" "No, I mean the thing they trapped in your story." "Oh," John said, keeping his voice low as he let his rifle lead the way. "They called it the Quileute, and it was a spirit of death. They had believed it was many creatures, but what appeared was a single creature. It was hairless, an oddity in a place like this, and it appeared to be like a shaved wolf. Its grotesque body looked alien to them, its red eyes glaring from within the boundaries they had set for it. The only place it had hair was on its feet, and that seemed to work in its favor. It could move without leaving a trace, making it a dangerous foe in the wild. With the creature trapped, though, it seemed that they had bottled death, but they had done too well. As we moved, following the bloody trail, I began to believe I could almost hear the snow breaking as something followed us. Suddenly, death couldn't take them. The hunters feared no enemy. The explorers feared not the mountain's cold or height. They explored the unimaginable, fought the incredible, and learned the things that had eluded them. The longer it went on, however, the less there was to seek. People became stagnant, and many of them wished for an end. They had lived and wanted to move on to what came next. They wanted to see those who had gone before them, or to be reunited with their loved ones, and they knew of only one way to do it. "Can't imagine too much life being a problem," I whispered, but immediately regretted it. I supposed after seeing the bone collector, I could imagine too much life being a little bit problematic. It was always a stretch for me too when I was a kid, but as I get older, I can kind of imagine why it might get old. At any rate, they made a deal with the creature. They would send those to him who were ready to go, and any who were foolish enough to hunt the woods by night would be his prey. He would stalk the woods, but leave the places of man alone, and he agreed to such terms if he could walk the land again. We saw something jutting up from the snow, and as we followed the blood smears, we found a cave. To call it a cave might be a little generous, but it was an overhang and looked fairly dry inside. Without knowing what was in there, however, it might as well have been the open mouth of a dragon. As we hunkered down to peek inside, a snarling wolf head suddenly leered from the mouth of the cave. He was huge, almost as large as the bears we'd seen, and its fur was patchy and scraggy. Its pink skin was covered in sores, its nose split down the middle like someone had taken a knife to it, and its teeth were double rows of sharp yellow fangs. It was a freak, a mutant of some sort, and both of us had 2 pounds of pressure on a 5-pound trigger when someone yelled for us to stop. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" From behind the creature came a half-grown man in filthy snow gear. "Liam," John said, pulling the man to him as he shivered in his arms. He was filthy and freezing, but he was still alive, and apparently the only survivor of the group. One of his legs was chewed up badly, his left arm a mass of infected-looking bites, and as he hobbled out of the woods, he told us what had happened. Ma was missing sheep, and Dad, well, you know Dad's been trapped by the same bottle he crawled into after the sawmill laid him off. Ma told me to just let it go. She always says it's the death hound, or whatever they call it, but I knew it was something flesh and blood. Spirits don't need to drag your sheep off into the woods, so we went to kill it. It got Ao first, drug him off into the dark, and tore him up. When we went to help him, it got Tom, too. It tore his throat out and just jumped on Mock, too. All the while, we just kept putting shots into it, and it shrugged it off like snowflakes. I ran as it jumped on Frank, and when I fell into that cave and bashed my head, everything went dark for a while. When I woke up, it was chewing on Frank, ignoring me as I pulled up my gun. It turned to look when I started shooting, though. I shot it 5 times before it finally stopped moving, and then I blacked out again. When I came awake, I was cut up and bit up and freezing. I pulled that thing on top of me and just kind of existed until you got here. He ended up living, but not without some scars. His arm became infected and had to come off, and he never walked again without a limp. Ultimately, John told me that he crawled into the same bottle as his father, and if I had demons like that kid, I probably would too. He'd seen some terrible things, but it was ultimately less supernatural than John had believed. We were back at the base for 1900 hours, and we were the toast of the town when we brought Liam home. The town did not accept us in one evening, but when I finally packed my bags and headed back to Georgia, I was welcome in any home within Weller-Brock. I had ceased to be an outsider, one of the few who ever accomplished it. We were treading familiar territory again, and I could see the house coming into view. It was nearly dusk, and my fingers felt frozen as I stuffed them into my pockets. Grandpa didn't seem to notice, but I was sure his nose had taken on a slightly blue tint after trekking all day. "Looks like our quarry's led us all the way back to the start," I commented, a little sourly. "Guess we won't be catching him after all." "Don't be so sure," Grandpa said, and I was suddenly aware of another set of prints heading for the house. I smiled as I saw Glimmer sitting on the porch steps in her usual garb, as if it wasn't cold enough to make her breath puff out. The cat in question was sitting on her lap, purring happily as she stroked its fur. It looked up mistrustfully as we approached, but she made a soothing noise, and it melted against her once again.
"There you are, Hunter. And Fisher, too. It's bad manners to leave a lady sitting in the snow. I could have caught a chill."
She rose with the cat in her arms, pecking me on the cheek as she moved onto the porch. "He a friend of yours?" I teased, stroking the cat as he nestled against her.
"Nope. But I knew his grandsire. I met him in the woods while Fisher was away playing soldiers when I was a mere slip of a girl."
"Sounds like Grandpa isn't the only one with a story today," I joked, as Glimmer cocked an eyebrow at me.
"Perhaps, but only if you fix me some of that delicious milk water like last time and invite me in out of the cold. I'll be happy to tell you how I found a poor lost beastie in my woods one night, and how I first became aware of this most remarkable creature you call cats."
I smiled as the three of us came inside, Grandpa moving to the phone as I went to get the fire going. Hot chocolate and a roaring fire sounded like the perfect way to end one story and start another. The fire crackled merrily as Glimmer lay stretched out before it, the dancing flames making her skin twinkle, which was how she had gotten her name from Grandpa, and the dazzles sent diamonds across the ceiling. I had stopped in the doorway to the living room to watch her as she sparkled. She grinned at me impishly as she held her hands out for the warm beverage. It occurred to me how young she seemed. She was like a girl in her early 20s, in both appearance and mannerism. I wondered not for the first time if she would be that way when I was Grandpa's age. She patted the fireplace as she sat up, inviting me to sit with her, and I brought the hot cocoa to her as I leaned back against the rough stonework. Grandpa was sitting in his favorite chair, watching the two of us with a knowing smile. I appreciated him for that, more than he would ever know. It would have been easy for him to be hurt, but he always seemed to take the closeness of Glimmer and I as just one of life's little blessings. The widow had been very happy to have her cat back, and she thanked us for finding him quickly. "He's a silly old thing, but he's all I've got, and I'm quite fond of him. I'm glad he didn't wander off in the snow and get himself frozen to death." She had excused herself pretty quickly, telling Grandpa it looked like he was entertaining. She gave him a wink, and I'm not sure I understood it, and then she drove carefully down the driveway, Grandpa waving at her from the porch. The three of us settled in and got ready for Glimmer to begin her story, the fire the only light in the room. Glimmer took a sip of hot cocoa and made an appreciative noise as the warmth fell over her.
That's good. We don't have anything quite that good in the woods.
Are you telling me your civilization has existed since before settlers came from England, but you haven't figured out hot cocoa yet? I asked with a little laugh. Glimmer gave me a withering look, but spoiled it by winking at me.
We have sweets, of course, just nothing quite this frivolous exists in our world. We have more immediate concerns, like survival.
And cats, apparently.
Yes, and cats.
Wait a minute, Grandpa said. When I made you the wooden cat, you didn't seem so surprised.
Well, I had seen wild cats before. They run everywhere in the forest. But this cat was different. He was so strange that I didn't immediately realize he was akin to the felines I knew.
She closed her eyes, and as the smoke wafted into her face, I could tell that she was time-traveling back to her girlhood days. Grandpa got that same look when he thought about the past, and I supposed it was universal. Glimmer was content to let the steam caress her for a few moments, beginning her story without much warning.
This was the time after Fisher's leaving. He had come to see me before he left, and he told me that he was going to fight in a war, that I have never fought in one. He said he would be gone for a long time, but that he hoped he would see me again. I didn't really understand, but I was upset at the thought of losing him. We had become close, and I didn't want to say goodbye. He told me this was something he had to do, but I didn't want to hear it. I told him to just go, that I didn't care if he came back or not, and turned away from him, so he wouldn't see the tears I was trying to hold back. When he said nothing, I turned back to find that I wasn't the only one failing to hold in my sorrow. I was used to seeing Fisher sad, but he had seemed different after his encounter with the bone collector. He told me this was a thing he had to do, and that getting away from the mountains for a while would be good for him. He wanted to see the world and grow into someone who could protect others. I refused to listen to his excuses though. I was young and spirited, and if he was going to leave, I told him to just go ahead and go. So we parted ways. I never knew if his sadness was as deep as mine, but it was several days before I was fit for much beyond moody turns. Life went on, though despite his advance, and many weeks later, I found myself in the woods again. Now, you may find it odd that I had never seen a cat before, but my people usually stay in the deep woods. I am considerate an oddity because I will go so close to human places. In those days, I would not even go that far. Fisher had always come to visit me near the borders of my world and his, and without him to visit, I hadn't been anywhere near the humans in ages. On this particular day, I was supposed to be gathering herbs for medicine, so my mother could cure some of our people who had become ill. I had collected quite a few herbs, but when I found that I was close to the border again, I got a bit reminiscent of the times I had spent with Fisher. So I decided to go and have a look at some of the other people that live in the area. I didn't know any of them, but Fisher had talked about some of them. His parents, his grandmother that had passed on, some of his neighbors, and of the friends he often went out with, who I knew had been killed by the strange lights. I wasn't afraid of being seen by any of them. I could move as gracefully through the woods as any deer, and I had hidden from the humans before. So I took my sack and bow and decided to see what I could see. I was hopeful at the start, but it was not the grand adventure I thought it would. I saw human signs, old fires, and the waste they sometimes leave behind, but I encountered no people. I followed a trail to Fisher's old house, but I couldn't bring myself to get close. I missed him terribly, and the thought of seeing something that would remind me of him made me sad. I had turned around, preparing to head home again, when the strangest little creature stood in my path. His fur was the color of a campfire, with dark browns and dots of gray. His ears had a distinctly chewed look, and his paws were large and very furry. He held a magnificent tail behind him, and he had come up on me without a sound. I was startled at first, drawing my bow and challenging him, but he mewed good-naturedly and cocked his head as if to ask what I was doing. But when it became apparent that he meant me no harm, I put my weapon away and bent down to touch him. He was very soft, not bristly, like some of the other cats in the woods. He was a little muddy, but it was clear that someone was taking great care of him, farther than any cat I had ever seen, and he showed me none of the hesitancy around me that many of the forest creatures did. I sat and let him butt his head against my hand. My other hand glided along his silky fur, and when he came to sit in my lap, I giggled as he rumbled against my stomach. When I heard the sound of people returning to Fisher Old House, I realized I had been sitting there for a while. I had become enchanted with this little beastie, and as he walked back into the woods, I followed him eagerly. We spent the night in the forest, hunting mice and playing with the leaves and sticks that caught his attention. As the night went on, and the more time we spent together, the better I felt about Fisher leaving. We were cuddling in the boughs of a tree, when the first fingers of sunlight began to peek over the horizon. I realized I had been out all night with him, and when I picked him up and headed for home, I had every intention of taking him with me. As we walked back through the woods, I was confident that no one in my enclave would be seeing anything like this before. Some of them had cats, but nothing as grand as this one. One of my cousins had a beautiful spotted cat, and my older sister had a white one with red eyes, but their hair was short and coarse and nowhere near as luxurious as this fellow. I smiled to myself as I thought of the jealousy on their faces when they saw him. Once Mother has touched his silky fur, there would be no way she couldn't turn it away. He would sleep next to my head at night, and I would drift off listening to the deep rumble of his purr. I was so involved with my daydream that I almost missed when he wiggled out of my arms. He had been riding along calmly until that point, purring against my side as the two of us walked. He looked back the way we could come and made that strange meow sound again. I was perplexed. Did he have a mate he needed to get back to? He started to walk away, but I picked him up again and tried to continue walking home. He wiggled out of my hands again though, and glanced back at me with remorse as he shook his little head. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Don't you want to come home with me?" In response, he started to walk off again. I took a step towards him, but I stopped myself before I could grab him up again. I turned around instead and headed for home, a little angry as I crunched through the underbrush. If he didn't want to come back with me, then so be it. I wouldn't force him. And the farther I got, the madder I became. Who cared if he didn't want to come back with me? I didn't need him. I had been fine before him, and I would be fine again. Let him wander off into the woods if that's what he wanted to do. Let him run afoul of a big mean coyote, or a hungry owl, or one of the bigger wildcats, or a snake, or... I wiped my eyes as they started to leak. The anger leaked out with them, and soon I was making my way back the way I had come. In my mind, I could really see him at the mercy of one of the coyote packs in the area or carried away by a hawk. He was a big fella, but wouldn't stand a chance against a pack of dogs. I wouldn't find him in time, I thought, or I would find him too late, or I would find nothing but a smear of blood and some of that gorgeous fur stuck in the pool. I swept at my eyes as the tears kept coming, already sure he was lost. The sky was pinkening through down still hours away, and when I heard him meow, I turned to find him cocking his head at me again. I laughed, scooping him into my arms and hugging him, and he wiggled and meowed in confusion. When I put him down again, he started walking the way we had come, and this time I followed him. I could see the light beginning to intrude on the dark world, but I didn't mind. Some members of my race cannot stand the light, but I have learned to love it. It stings my eyes and makes my skin burn a little, but I try to spend some time each day in the sun, knowing that my friends are part of that light world. That thin line on the horizon would have been enough to send both my parents scuttling back to the depths of the enclave. But I followed my new friend, evenly as he made his way. I expected I would find a little burrow of beasts like him, perhaps even some little ones with a mate who would be worried. But as we go closer to the edges of humanity, I realized where he was heading. When we came to the edge of his home, the lights already on the big house. He looked back at me, much the same way I had looked at him on the border of my world. "What? Don't you want to come with me?" That look said, but I shook my head at him. "No, this is where we must part ways, little friend." He came back, butting up against my leg and giving me another rub of his silky fur, and then he trotted off for home, bounding up in the back porch steps as he sat patiently at the door. I had turned to leave, the dawn very close now, when a high and excited voice found its way to my ear. "Clarence, you came back!" I peeked through the trees and saw a little girl pulling him into her arms. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, and as she rubbed her face against the gats, I realized this had been where he was returning to. She was his family. She was the one had been trying to get back to, and I felt a little guilty for trying to keep him. He had home already, and my ownership of him had been a knack of death. "I told Mommy you wouldn't come back. I'm sorry I put you outside yesterday while I was trying to nap. I won't do it again. Come on, let's get you some breakfast. Then we can brush you and get you." But their plans were cut off by the closing door. And as the day began, I slipped back into the woods and made my day as home as well.
The fire crackled as she finished, and I saw a tear roll down her cheek as she remembered that day.
I think in a way that was how I said goodbye to you as well, Fisher.
To me? Grandpa smiled.
You were never mine to keep either. I felt hurt when you left, that I didn't admit it. You were gone, and I thought I could simply exist without you. Watching that cat go, realizing that it might get hurt and feeling hurt that it wouldn't stay, made me remember how you had left as well. I needed to come to terms with that, which helped a lot.
We all sat silently for a while, Glimmer putting her head on my shoulder as the fire crackled merrily behind us. When Grandpa chuckled suddenly, I looked up and saw Glimmer cock a sardonic eye at him. "I had to get a cat out of the widow's house once. She didn't know it was a cat, of course. She thought it was a haint that had taken up residence in her attic. So there I am, prepared to do battle with a dark spirit, and I step into the attic and find myself face to face with a highly upset bobcat." Glimmer's hand slipped into mine as the two of us listened and laughed as Grandpa unfurled his tale of a spirited wild animal and a very surprised Grandpa. We sat by the fire as the snow came down, and the fire warmed our bones. I could feel Glimmer's comfortable weight as she leaned against me, and as Grandpa unveiled his latest story, I smiled, enjoying these small blessings as they came. I sighed as I took in the destruction in the shed. It had been like this all week, and I was getting a little tired of it. Something had been breaking into our sheds and chicken pens, and I was at a loss to determine what it was. It was big, but it was also smart, and neither doors nor windows seemed to bother it much. It ate meat, as the 4 new chickens we had bought could attest, and grain, as our ripped open sacks of fish feed and chicken feed could attest. I had wondered if it might be a young bear cub, but Grandpa thought it might be a fox, given its craftiness. "Any luck, boy?" he asked, stumbling up beside me with a leathery smile. "Nothing yet. I tell you, Gramps, this thing is tricky." When I had replaced the twist of metal on the chicken coop with a hook lock, it had gotten around it. When I replaced the hook lock with a crossbar on the shed, it had gotten around that too, coming in through a window. Whatever this thing was, it was smarter than your average possum, and I was beginning to wonder what exactly I was dealing with. "Maybe it's the little people," Grandpa said, smiling as he said it. "What, like the fairies you throw bottles for?" "Not quite. More like the ones I met in Alaska. They could just walk in and out of places, and they were wicked smart, too." I opened the door on the varmint trap and wrinkled my nose as I pulled out the bait that Lenny had given me at the trading post. It smelled like old cheese and bad blood, but he said it would attract all kinds of things. Most scavengers couldn't resist it, and even some of the larger predators would find it tasty. I made sure to sprinkle some corn around it, and even set some of the mutilated chicken carcass in there as well, just for good measure. "Sounds like quite a tale. Wanna tell me about it?" It was coming on dark now, the sunset making the sky glow a deep red, and Grandpa nodded as he set off for the house. As the darkness fell, we sat around the kitchen table, drinking cold beers as Grandpa reminisced. "It all started with a briefing from the base colonel and a strange report from some lookouts. We had assembled my unit, what was left of it, and we were about 20 in all. We had some new blood come in, raw recruits, most of them, but there was talk that they meant to send us to the front line. They were starting to push back against the Nazis, and they needed just about every hand to make it happen. The problem was that we weren't in Alaska to stop the Germans. We were in Alaska to stop the Russians. The United States military had decided that Russia might decide to swoop in after the war and take back the rich oil deposits in Alaska, or that the Japanese would come in and beat them to it if the war went south for us. They also had some suspicions that the native population were working with the Russians and meant to turn on us. It was all malarkey, though. John said there were a lot of stories about how the Ruskies were worse than we were to the natives, and that any notion that they would welcome them back was preposterous. The fact of the matter is, the Russians subjugated us harshly, splitting up families and using children and wives as leverage against tribal attacks. The United States hasn't treated us much better in the past, but currently we're mostly ignored and tolerated. This is considered progress." It didn't sound so great to me, and he said it with a sad smile that let me know he was practicing his gallows humor. Anyway, I've gone off trail. The reason for the meeting was some of our lookouts had seen something strange on a nearby island, a little patch of land called Kepchki. Now, Kepchki was little more than 20 miles from the center in all directions. They had a little population of elk and lots of native birds nested there in the warm months. The fishing around the island was supposed to be particularly choice, but the natives did not, as a rule, go to the island. John wouldn't say why, but I suspected it had something to do with cultural superstition, like the woods near town. The island had trees on it, and fresh water, probably other resources, but the army was concerned that the Reds or the Japanese might be using it as a listening post. Our lookouts have seen what they might call people moving around on the island. Intel says it's nothing definitive, no confirmed sightings, but the lookout guys think it might be humanoid in appearance. Humanoid in appearance was something the lookouts used to describe a lot of stuff. Small bears, monkeys, hell, even large otters, so I've been told, have fallen under humanoid in appearance. It's ass-covering language, to be sure, but you get a glimpse of something, and it might be nothing, but in case it's something, you call it in anyway. The colonel was putting together a small team to go out and investigate, and I was selected for it. John was asked to go as well, the brass thinking his knowledge of the area might be useful, and they put about 6 of the recruits under us to back us up. John and I had a reputation for handling ourselves, and I think when we found those boys and brought John's nephew back from the woods, it went a long way to speaking for our character. So they piled 8 of us into a pontoon boat, and away we went for Kepchki. The waters were pretty fair that day, and as we rowed, I asked John why his people didn't take advantage of the island's resources. A place like that in Appalachia would have been hunted, clear-cut, and settled for sure. John looked like he didn't want to say, but he trusted me, and finally came out with it. "Legend says that the island is home to the Rinrat," he finally said, keeping his voice low. He had to repeat it for me a couple of times, and I told him it was a bit of a mouthful. "They're little people, not of our world, but similar. They're said to be able to step in and out of our world, and they like to hunt and gather as we do. They had been sighted on the island before, but they don't like to be disturbed. If we see them, we should leave. They aren't hostile, but they don't like being disturbed, and they can turn violent. We have something similar back home. Grandma always told me not to encroach on fairyland, and your Ringrat sound a lot like them." We came to the shore then, and as we stepped off, I left 4 of them to make camp as we slunk into the bush. The trees were little more like the firs I had back home, and the ground was carpeted with needles and limbs. The ground was stony, but the soil was rich and brown. It felt moist as I took a handful of it to test, and I figured there might be bushes that had nuts or fruit somewhere on the island too. It was good soil, and it must have taken a lot of fear to keep the natives from it. We had walked a short way in before I discovered that we weren't the island's first explorers. We were moving slowly, keeping an eye on our surroundings, when John tapped my shoulder and pointed off to the left. "Tent," he whispered, and as I squinted, I did see something that looked like a tent pole jutting up near us. I got the boys in order, and we crunched as quietly as we could towards the potential enemy camp. Well, they were potential enemies, but I doubt they'd be raising many alarms when we happened upon them. We came on a few tents, the poles the only thing left behind, for some fur scraps. No canvas on these puppies, and the metal poles were old and less uniform than the ones the army gave us. Sitting around the remains of what could charitably still be called a fire pit were 3 skeletons, picked clean and grinning. There was a lonely food tin sitting next to 'em, and one had a bottle clutched in his bony fingers as if he needed only to lift it to his disappeared lips. All of 'em grinned merrily, as if to invite us to the party, and it was a sobering sight. We checked around, but there was very little to be found. The tin was free of labels or legends, and the bottle was brown like a medicine glass, but bore no signs. The skeletons wore scraps of clothes they had died in, but time had almost eaten these away as well. The tent was no help either. The furs had dissolved, and the metal was just crude poles. They could be American or Russians or Martians for all we knew. It seemed like the cold had killed them, but as the 2 recruits moved off, John pointed to the ribs of the one holding the bottle. They were chipped, as if something had pierced between 2 of them. "A knife, maybe," I suggested, but John only shrugged. We hit the other side of the island about an hour later, but we wouldn't see anything else until our trip back. We had decided to crisscross the island during the day, not really keen on staying the night after finding the old campsite. We would eat dinner and pack up at sunset, hopefully marching back to the barracks by nightfall. We were coming back towards the boat, maybe 20 minutes from where we had left the others, when we heard something. It was a perfect baritone, sounding like someone singing from the bottom of a well. I called for a stop, and we all got low as I pulled out my binoculars and started looking for the source of the singing. I found it picking up sticks near the juncture of two firs, and it was an odd little creature, to be sure. It was a perfectly normal human, though shrunk to the size of a toddler. I don't mean it was a little person, though that's the closest I can come to describing it. It had a long beard and a thick set of eyebrows. It appeared hairy, though that could have been furs too. There was something on its belt, a knife or a small axe, and it rolled along comfortably as it collected wood. This was a normal day for the creature, something it had done 1,000 times before, and it was no more wary of its surroundings than I would have been in my own woods. The song it sang was deep and old as the hills. Its voice lacked nothing so much as rocks rolling down a mountain. I prepared to tell the boys that we would be going around when the crash of a rifle drowned out John's warning. One of the recruits, Gibbs, I think his name was, had seen it too as he peeked through his rifle scope. He had seen it and probably jumped to the conclusion that it was an enemy. There was a lot of hurtful propaganda about those of Asian descent at the time. This kid probably thought he had stumbled on a Japanese spy. John had seen him a moment too late, his own binoculars trained on the thing, and his shout hadn't come in time. The bullet hit the creature, but it was like shooting a brick wall with a pea shooter. It stumbled, never really losing its footing, and when it turned to look at our position, I knew we were in trouble. It seemed to fall into itself, its body pulling into a stormy hole that it drug close behind it, and I yelled for the rest to run. We took off through the firs, but we were not alone. Gibbs and the other one, I forget his name, were not as adept in the woods as John and I, and it showed. They tripped and stumbled over roots that we missed easily, and when Gibbs cried out in pain, I reached back to catch him. The kid thought he'd twisted his ankle, but I saw the source of his problem. A little arrow was sticking out of his lower leg, and as I offered him a shoulder, I reached down and broke it off. The woods were suddenly full of grunts and growls, little projectiles flying in to stab and prod as we ran for it. He likely hadn't hurt the creature, but it was mad now, and mad goes a long way. John called out, letting us know the beach wasn't very far, and we ran for our lives as the brush crackled under our feet. They had to be at least a dozen, and I could see furry bodies and hairy creatures as they moved about. They gnashed their teeth too big for their childish faces, and I knew now what had stripped those bodies in the clearing. They may not be violent, but scavengers will scavenge, won't they? I tossed a prayer to the man upstairs, hoping for a little luck, and as we came out of the trees, I sighed in relief. We probably looked like explorers at the end of a native film, and the irony of that statement isn't lost on me. We scared the hell out of those kids we'd left at camp, and they looked confused when I told them to get to the boats. They wanted to pack the gear, to grab the supplies, but I told them to grab their rifles and leave everything else. One of them ended up in the boat without his boots, another one leaving his coat behind, but as we shoved off into the water, I expected that the arrows would follow us on our way. Nothing came to the shore, however. Nothing followed us into the water, and as we floated out into the bay, the others asked what had happened. Before Gibbs could start in, I overrode him. We ran up on some polar bear cubs, and the mother wasn't far behind. We barely made it out alive, and it's a wonder that she didn't chase us into the bay. Gibbs gave me a look, but my look was stonier. It told him flatly not to press it, and just to learn that sometimes caution is best. We went back and told the brass about what had happened, and they figured that the bears were what had been seen. The lookouts didn't see anything on the island after that, other than our gear, which they sent a unit back to get later. Gibbs never talked, thankfully, and John and I agreed to never speak of what we had seen there. The old stories were right, and the island was the property of the Irencrat. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but that was when I heard the snap of the trap from the shed. Grandpa and I set out, flashlights bobbing, and found a very angry fox sitting in the cage as he yelped and begged to be let out, in his high and unknowable voice. Grandpa chuckled. Sometimes, though, it's just a crafty fox with too much curiosity for his own good. We'll get Glimmer to set him loose somewhere far from here. No sense killing him for being smart and hungry. We let him stew for the night, Grandpa yawning as he returned to the kitchen table. I stayed in Alaska for quite a while, but the war couldn't last forever. Maybe next time I'll tell you about its end, and how I ended up staying in Alaska for longer than I meant to. Grandpa's yawn was contagious, and I told him that it sounded like a plan, after a big yawn of my own. With the mystery of our food thief solved, it was time for some much-deserved rest.